We went into great detail about the Christmas truce of 1914 and the little mini truces that happened during the rest of the course of the war. Well, in this talk segment, we're getting into the Angel of Mons, which is, one of the most enduring legends of the Great War. It's a very famous episode of divine intervention, divine angelic intervention. An angelic army comes to the assistance of the British forces against the Germans during the Battle of Mons in Belgium. This battle is also known as the Battle of the Frontiers. Now this skirmish happens, massive skirmish I might add, happens on August 22nd and 23rd, 1914. The descent from heaven of angelic forces, the divine intervention, comes at a crucial moment in the fighting. The British are being driven back by the relentless German advance. This incident is widely reported in both the press and in silent movie newsreels. And German prisoners of war corroborated the events. These angelic forces are armed with bows and arrows, and a towering, glowing figure on a shining white horse that is said to be St. George spurs on the British forces, and he's holding a fiery sword. Now, in some reports, there are three angelic beings that are seen by the British hovering in the air over the German lines. Some soldiers claimed to have also seen St. Michael the Archangel. Other soldiers said that they saw Joan of Arc and the Virgin Mary. Now this legend, this story, becomes a source of deep inspiration and has lasting power. The few survivors of the battle, by the end of the war, 1918, there's very few people left alive. By 1918 who started fighting in 1914. Most are dead. The few survivors have changed lives. They become pillars of their community. They are spiritually changed forever. Now, historians tend to ignore the fact that the soldiers' diaries are filled with references to this supernatural event. And consider this divine intervention as mass hallucination or shell shock. But as I mentioned, the survivors considered it God's sanction, an active support against their opponents, the Germans. The Coldstream Guardsmen, these are British soldiers, were the last to retreat. They get lost in the Mormon forest and dig in. They're ready to make a last stand. Well, a dimly outlined female angel appears with flowing white robes. She is tall and slender with massive wings. The guardsmen follow the glowing angelic figure across an open field to a hidden sunken road. This enables them to escape and saves their lives. Now, this bit of World War I folklore has, as I mentioned, has staying power, and over the years has won many believers. There's no doubt in my mind that something very unusual happened during the massive battle and during the British retreat. A century of historical and scientific debate has found many reputable sources that point to an actual supernatural event at Mons. Now, Mons was the center of an industrial mining area in Belgium, an endless series of broken pits, deep ditches, and 100-foot slag heaps. Now, during the battle, there's 70,000 British troops and roughly 250,000 Germans, 250,000 German soldiers. The British are isolated and have no strategic defensive position. The Germans, well, their guns are on the high ground. They break out of the woods and come in swarms towards the entrenched British. They pretty much swamp the British. There's massive, independent, and uncoordinated gunfire from the British that has a devastating effect on the German forces. They are turned back. The Germans then approach from the south, and the wave of the attack spreads westward. The British forces are slowly surrounded. The battlefield is now littered with the dead and the wounded. Now, the forest of Marmal intervenes between the two corps of the British. The forest was the place for the last alleged sighting of the angelic forces. Now, Captain Arthur Osborne, who's from the 4th Dragoon Guards, a cavalry unit. Yes, cavalry is still being used during World War I. Writes in his diary of luminous cloud formations that remind him of Milton's descriptions of the fallen angels being driven into hell by St. Michael and the angelic armies of God. 2nd Corps Commander Darian Smith, in his diary, credits his narrow escape and those of his fellow exhausted soldiers to angelic bowmen, heaven-sent angels, and also gives a dramatic description of the clouds looking like legions of battling angels. Now, these two men never met each other during the battle. The German prisoners of war, those that are captured, write in their diaries and letters home of a force of phantoms, spectral soldiers that stave off disaster for the British when all seemed lost. Now, the British have a long history of linking the military and the heavenly. For example, the Battle of Edge Hill in 1642. This is during the English Civil War, where rumors of dead soldiers rising from the earth spreads like wildfire. Then there's the Battle of Marston Moor in 1644, in which a body of heavenly horsemen are seen in the sky. There are many, many more examples available. There's a long legacy of battle apparitions for the British armies. Many stories in the oral tradition of combat success due to divine intervention, narrow escapes, and wondrous victories. Now, a possible explanation for this is that during a time of stress or national crisis, fact and the supernatural blend together into a myth or legend. Or perhaps there's actual divine protection against defeat. Who the hell knows? Certainly not me. I'm not going to venture a guess. Mons is in fact the first major advancement or engagement of the Great War. The battle was perceived as a key moment in the conflict, an indication that defeating Germany would not be as easy as the British and French High Command had thought. Remember, the British are outnumbered and outflanked. For them to actually hold off the Germans as long as they did is really quite remarkable. It's a minor miracle in itself. Now, there's a possible source for the legend. Arthur Machen. For those of you who don't know, Arthur Machen was a British fantasy horror writer who's inspired by the reports of the accounts at Mons and writes a short story, The Bowman. This comes out virtually within days of the actual conflict in September 1915. In the story, The Bowman, well, there's phantom bowmen, a long line of shining beings that are summoned by a soldier calling on St. George. The story was written from a first-hand perspective. The short story is a type of false documentation. Now, Machen also wrote a number of factual articles on the Great War, and the short story is taken as fact by many people. It was printed in the London Evening News. Several parish and church newsletters and magazines republish Machen's fictional short story. Spiritualist magazine also republishes the story. And the magazine tells of many frontline soldiers' visions of supernatural forces. These church newsletters and the magazine give rise to a flurry of similar accounts, and rumors spread quickly and wildly. Now, descriptions vary. You have phantom medieval bowmen. You have angelic warriors on horses with flaming swords. You have strange luminous clouds. Now, all these descriptions are very similar to folkloric tales found in medieval and ancient warfare, when the Christian God intervenes directly against an evil pagan army. Angelic warriors were considered as proof of the action of divine providence on the side of the Allies. There's many sermons across Great Britain. The story, as I mentioned, spreads to newspaper reports all over the world. There's a vast number of publications that claim to provide evidence of the angelic army's existence. For example, Brigadier General John Chartiers, who's a very high-ranking officer, publishes his original letters with entries on the angelic army. The public believes in the story of the angelic